thinking about how human beings, I know you say this a lot too, human beings are actually meant to be in nature.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And why do you say that? Just for all the concrete jungle dwellers out there, you know, who have like a little dying house plant like in the corner of their house that they can barely keep alive. Like inspire us, Xandra. Tell us more about nature.
There are so many reasons. So in Christian biology, we have what we call the 3 R's, okay? So the first R is reservation. And in this approach, you want to put a fence around nature, and you keep humans outside and you keep nature inside, because you're trying to protect nature from ourselves, right? So that's reservation. Then you have restoration. Restoration is when human beings go into nature, a natural system that has been degraded or destroyed, to try and bring it back to the way it was always meant to be. So it looks like a lot of planting forests. Maybe you're reintroducing species that used to live there that are no longer there. You're trying to bring it back to life, right? So that's restoration. The last R, which is the most compelling, which is what I'm really looking into and researching, is called reconciliation. And reconciliation ecology looks like humans and nature learning how to live together again, in the way that we were always meant to live together. And part of the reason why this is so important is we see what happens to human beings when you separate them from nature, and it's not pretty. It's just not pretty. A friend of mine is a horticultural therapist, and horticulture therapy is when you rehabilitate people who have maybe they've been in a car accident or something's happened to them, and it's sort of like occupational therapy, but it's in nature. A lot of times it's in a garden setting, and they find that there's a huge percentage of people who recover much, much more quickly in a horticultural setting than if they were just simply in a hospital room. There's this connection between people and nature that we see all the time. And the same we can say for nature. It's not just that nature benefits us, but we actually benefit nature. And I could get more into that data, but it's a little more complicated.
Man, yeah, makes me just want to go like live in the woods, be wild.
Although cities are good, can I just say that?
Yeah, please.
Cities are very good. Conservationists love cities because they have a smaller footprint, right? There's more up than out. And when you get a lot of people together, you know, if you think of me in my apartment and I have 2 apartments next to me, one above, one below, and one behind me, my heating bill is going to be very small because we're all packed together. So there is that too.
Nice.
Yeah.
So if you're living in some
Don't
tiny
feel bad.
apartment, yeah, right.
Don't feel
You're
bad.
saving the planet. Way to go. Okay, so Xandra, as we talk about, like, I love the philosophical perspective you bring to the environment, but there's a massive problem that I think anyone who spends any amount of time watching National Geographic documentaries or even like witnessing nature themselves, they realize is that there's conflict. There's massive amounts of wonder in nature, and there's also massive amounts of pain and agony and suffering in nature. And I can think of documentaries I've seen where there's a species of Komodo dragon that hunts deer over the course of weeks and takes bites out of them, but there's a venom there that slows the deer down, so it's like a walking larder for this Komodo dragon.
That's awful.
Which is, terrifying. You just don't want to be that deer. So how do you reconcile the cruelty and the wonder that you can't help but observe?
Oh, such a good question, Kasey. And this is something that I really struggled with when I was just getting into biology. During my undergraduate, I was assisting research in the parasitology lab. So I was studying parasites and how incredible and just engineered in this incredible way to get into something and destroy it slowly from the inside out, which is awful. Man. And it was really bothersome to me because I was thinking, all right, I believe in a good creator, but I look around the world and I see these things. I see mosquitoes, I see bacteria, I see viruses. What does this mean for a creator? Why would a good creator make a world where there is so much destruction? And I think, again, we have to come back to Genesis, back to the very beginning, and think, what happened? Because when God created his natural world, he stepped back and looked at it and said, it's good, right? So he's making a value judgment about nature, saying it's pleasing to him. And if at that time there were dinosaurs destroying each other and all of these bacteria eating through trees and all these things, certainly I could say we wouldn't say that's good, right? So what's going on there? Well, with the fall, with sin entering the natural world, so with sin entering the human world, we also see that sin entered the natural world. That's very clear in Genesis. In the Proto-Evangelium, God...
Sorry, the what?
The Proto-Evangelium. Oh, sorry. So the Proto-Evangelium is Latin for the first telling of the good news, or the first proclamation from Evangelia, from evangelism. So that occurs in Genesis, and it's when the Lord says to Eve, your pain will be increased in childbearing, and the ground will produce thorns for you. And he goes through this entire thing explaining to them exactly what the repercussions of their sin will be, what that is going to look like, not just for them as individuals, but certainly for humanity and for the world at large. And then, of course, he foretells the coming of Christ, the crushing of the serpent under the heel. So, with that, we see that the natural world was degraded because of sin. So the natural world in and of itself is very, very good. It's still good, it's still beautiful, it's still made by a loving creator for a purpose. However, that being said, it is very, very broken and very, very fallen. If we take viruses, for example, life on this planet would not be possible without viruses. The vast majority of viruses are incredibly good. There are so many symbiotic relationships between viruses and plants. I use the word symbiotic loosely because viruses aren't actually considered living. They're not considered life because they can't reproduce by themselves. But you see this beneficial relationship where viruses will live inside of a plant and protect the plant from bad bacteria coming in or something like that. We wouldn't have the rain cycle that we have if we didn't have viruses. That are up in the air, that aerosol, that create this nucleation, this clustering that encourages precipitation. So a lot of just basic life that we see on Earth is thanks to viruses. But the 0.00001% or whatever it is that are deleterious are very, very, very deleterious.
It's that small percentage of viruses that are actually
incredibly
harmful.
small.
Wow.
Incredibly. There are viruses everywhere. There are viruses in the air all around us right now.
Wow.
On this table. If you took all the viruses on the planet and you weighed them, it would be 25 million blue whales worth of weight. So they're literally everywhere on the planet. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Especially given that at the time of recording this, right, there's one virus in particular that I think everyone's on edge about, the coronavirus, right?
Which has been around for forever, the coronavirus. I mean, we first encountered that in the early 1900s, and there are different strains of it. This happens to be a particularly bad one.
Yeah. Okay, Xandra, so here's a question that I've really enjoyed throwing at people recently. So just in the course of your life, what is something that you've changed your mind on? That you now see really clearly, and you wish other people in the world could see your perspective on this thing just as clearly as you do.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. What I'm thinking of, I don't have it 100% figured out, but I want to share it anyway in case it's helpful to people. So, as I mentioned before, when I was younger, I became really passionate about the environment and about nature and about preserving it. But I found myself so worried about it and so burdened about the problems that it was almost debilitating. And I had a lot of anxiety and fear about that, and also just sorrow, deep sorrow about I'm remembering one story in particular when I was in New Zealand working on my master's degree, and I lived in a house with a couple other people, and they had a cat and a dog, and right behind the house was this nature preserve, and I used to go in there looking for this one particular bird that I heard was nesting in the area, and I had been looking for this thing, hoping to see it in the wild for like a year, and hadn't found it. But one day I come home to the house, and there on the kitchen floor is one of these birds, dead, destroyed by the cat, totally defeathered. And I just had this moment of complete and utter despair, like, why am I working so hard to preserve these creatures that nobody else cares about? And so a lot of people who are passionate about the environment, passionate about conservation, will feel this despair or this sorrow about either ignorance of people or the fact that we can't do as much as we wish we could do. But I come back to the scriptures, and I come back to the way that God judges us for our actions. And a big part of that is dependent upon how much we know, right? So there's a difference between I know that something is right, I know that something is good, and I refuse to do it, versus I didn't even know it was there and I acted out of ignorance. So I think there is a huge level of grace. We want to be as conservative and as good-hearted towards nature as we can be, but part of it is because of human ignorance and because we lack perfect knowledge, we don't always know how to do that properly. So there's a fine line between, you don't want to be apathetic, you don't want to just do nothing, but at the same time, you don't want to let yourself be consumed and destroyed by the problem and by the issue and by fear and anxiety. We weren't given a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power and a sound mind. And so I think Jesus Christ helps us to walk that middle line. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So even your philosophy of the environment there is helping you like live your life in a sense where there's a criteria by which your actions, you're going to be held responsible, but it also lets you like sleep at night.
Yeah. And it's a tricky line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we haven't even got into the weeds of like what that line would be. But we might have to save that for another podcast because I'm sure there's so much there.
Yeah.
Xandra, you are awesome.
You are awesome.
Hey, I mean, I didn't say that just so I can get a compliment, but you know, I am pretty awesome. Thank you. Thanks for this interview, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for having me. Nailed it. Punched it in the face.
Punched it so hard, right in the face.